Well, former First Lady Michelle Obama, thank you for being here to talk with us about your new book.
Thanks for having me.
The book is called The Light We Carry, Overcoming in Uncertain Times. And I have to tell you, I read Becoming, and this is a really different book. Becoming was obviously this very intimate, peeling back the layers of your personal story, your family story that I think so many people have wanted to know for so long. But this book it's more practical. It's like a guidebook almost.
Yeah, I call it a toolkit. I mean, I think I'm like everybody over the last few years. We have been struggling. You know, economic uncertainty, a pandemic, isolation, injustice. It's kind of left us all feeling out of sorts. And so I get a lot of questions from people. It's like, how do I cope? And given my motto, when they go low, we go high, a lot of people these days have been struggling to figure out how to stay high when it feels like the world is in a low place. And so this book is my best attempt at offering people at least a look into my toolbox, the practices and habits, the people who keep me balanced. And hopefully it'll start a conversation, because I think that that's a lot of what we're feeling. We've been locked away from one another and we're feeling disconnected, and we need to get back together and uncover ourselves with each other and figure out how do we adapt in an inevitably uncertain world.
One of the things that you said in this book is that when you released Becoming several years ago, it was like a breath of fresh air after the time that your family spent in the White House. So I'm curious to you, as you're about to set off on your book tour, as you're bringing this book into the world, if that was a big breath, if that was a release, what does this process feel like?
You know, whenever you are putting yourself out into the public, I am no different. It is frightening.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I talk about in this book how even though Becoming was a breath of fresh air, there's something about making yourself vulnerable in the world. We may make it look easy, but we still go through that doubting process. Did I share too much? How will people receive the truth that I have to offer? So, you know, I'm in that same place with this book. My hope is that people will find something useful in it. And I've spent my time alone with this book, talking with myself and with the few people that I've let look at it. Now I'm sharing these thoughts. Do they make sense? Do they connect with people? Do they resonate? I don't know. So there is still a fear, a doubt, a vulnerability that goes into any project that I take on. So I'm feeling a little nervous.
You know, what strikes me when I'm reading the book is you get vulnerable, not just about yourself, but you talk about your marriage. We learn about the fact that your daughters are now dating. Were you talk about this idea of being comfortably afraid, of really being able to harness that fear. How did you think about the things that you shared with all of us, with your readers, about your family's lives?
You know, I always have to strike a balance of how much sharing will help people and how do I make sure that I'm protecting my family's privacy. But I think about my writing like I think about everything else. I learn from stories. I never want to produce anything that feels didactic, finger pointing. All I have is my own authentic truth. So I feel like if I'm coming from that place, and I've gotten the permission of my family members, then I feel like, okay, there's a lesson here. So when I talk about my relationship with my husband, it's because I know that there are a lot of young people who are trying to figure out what is a marriage? How do you shape a relationship? I am fascinated by how little we talk to young people, young adults, about what it actually means to partner with somebody and what those compromises look like. And, pushing them to answer questions for themselves of what are you trying to get out of this relationship with this other person? Have you thought it through? Are you seeking a wedding or do you want a relationship? Those are two very different things. So in the chapter that's called Partnering Well, again, I share my journey with my husband, the things that stuck out for me, what I was trying to find in another person, and how that worked out over the course of 30 years. We are now celebrating our 30th anniversary with the hopes that, it will create a conversation among the next generation of people trying to start to build their lives. What do you look for in a partner? What do you have to bring to a relationship yourself in order to make it whole and healthy?
I think that's something that so many people are curious about. People, I think, and you've written about this, they have idealized your marriage. They sit there and look at it, but you have always been very clear-eyed and very honest that marriage takes work. It takes daily work, and that it is not always glamorous. And you have had some very unique strains, but there's also the strains that any of us who are in a relationship or married face, whether it be whose career goes first or who takes on the childcare labor. How do you think about, is there one piece of advice that you would give for people who are thinking about how you put in that work for a partnership that's lasted that long?
Yeah, it's not really one piece of advice. To me, it's a philosophy. It's an outlook. In this age of, we want everything now, we want everything quick. When life is everything but that. We have to understand that marriage is never 50-50. You sort of wonder how that idea kind of got out there. I have found that if you stick with it, over the course of your entire relationship, you may have 50-50 over time. But if I look over my marriage, if I were to judge it in year 5 or year 10, there was never 50-50. Somebody was always giving way more. Someone always needed a different kind of thing. You have to evolve with it. And so, there were times when I felt like I was 70% in and he was doing 30%. But I think that, and I've had to compromise as he has. I've had to, because of the choices that I made in the terms of how I wanted our family to look. Yeah. I had to take my foot off of my career gas pedal, never putting on the brake, but slowing up a little bit. Those are the natural compromises that are required. And I feel bad when I see young people giving up on their relationships because there are periods of there are periods of discomfort. As I have told young people who ask me about marriage, I was like, you have to be prepared to have long stretches of discomfort. And long, I mean, it could last for years. And don't put kids into the equation, because that's just another layer of complication. You love them to death, but they will shake your marriage up and turn you both upside down. So I think it's important for us to be honest in those conversations, not to glamorize what a partnership feels like, because then young people quit too soon. They quit before they've really, played out the full scenario.
One of the things that I love that was a through line that ran throughout this book is the evolving relationships between parents and children, and particularly mothers and daughters. And you wrote a lot about your relationship with your mom, who we all know played a pivotal role with living with your family during your years in the White House. I'm curious, what has that been like from you as your relationship has evolved into being both adults to now having adult children? What does that look like for you?
I think it's a beautiful journey. One of the things I share, some of the, unique brand of wisdom that my parents brought to their parenting, I share that in the book. But something I admired about my mother is that, she had a clear philosophy about parenting, which is unusual for somebody of her generation. There weren't all the what to expect books and the Dr. Hootie-Doo books on how to parent, but there was just a common sense way that approach that she brought to parenting. But she always talked about, she said, I'm not raising children, I'm raising adults. And so I always had an interestingly open and honest conversation with my parents. They encouraged us to talk at an early age, to find our voices. She made sure we felt heard. She made sure that she took our concerns and issues seriously. We were never treated as kids should be seen and not heard. So when you have that foundation, your relationship is always, I feel, at least with my mother, and I've tried to do that with my daughters, has been on a steady course of growth. but you still have to be ready for your kids to evolve. Who they are at 4 and 7 is not what they need from you is very different from what they need from you as teenagers, and then again as young women. But if you've laid a foundation of trust and honesty, every stage I found is wonderful. It's full. It's exciting. I don't miss any stage. I loved every stage of parenting my girls, but I wouldn't go back to any of the stages. I don't long for the time when they were babies. I love that time. Breastfeeding, when you could sit and hold them and look at them forever. But now that they're young women, and now I'm less of a day-to-day manager and more of an advisor, there's a freedom to enjoy them as individuals, to watch them grow. And I think that's been the case for me and my mom as well.
With your girls, though, has that been comfortable for you, the idea of stepping back from that manager role and letting them lead, letting them be the people who make you and your husband, as you say, weak martinis when you come and visit their apartment? I couldn't stop laughing when I read that.
Well, it is a hard thing to do, to let your kids be. In this era of helicopter parenting, where I think parents are very, maybe overly involved in their kids' lives. I was raised to be handed my competence early. My mother raised her, as I write in the book, she says her job is to put herself out of a job early. So she started at a very early age, requiring us to be independent. As early as kindergarten, she gave us alarm clocks because she knew that we were capable of getting ourselves up. She wanted us to feel the power of our competence. So from 5 years old, I was setting an alarm. Soon thereafter, I was walking to school by myself. And what that does for a kid when your parent trusts you, it encourages you. It tells you that if my mom thinks I can do this, then I must be capable. And I've tried to instill that same kind of stand by the gate and watch your kids fly. Be there for them when they come back. Let them know that you will be their advocate, but don't step in and try to live their lives for them. And so when I see my kids flourishing in that way, when I see them owning all their choices and succeeding and failing on their own terms and growing from that process, it is one of the most satisfying experiences. It is frightening. It is frightening to watch your children walk into a brick wall, but that's what growth is. And, and too many parents try to stop that process. But that's the quickest way for them to learn from owning their mistakes and owning their victories at the same time. But you got to get adjusted. I mean, I talk about how, when you're letting your kids go, you're letting your heart out there in the world. That Barack and I kind of do this kind of crazy parent text check-in, like writing things that are keeping us up at night. Barack one day sent them a text on earthquake preparedness because they now live in LA. And that's the kind of thing you do as a parent. You think, uh-oh, there are earthquakes. Mm-hmm. Have I warned them? Are they prepared? So in the middle of the night, he's sending some article on a 10-step plan that includes, getting earthquake training and stocking up on water. And the response from one of my daughters was, okay, which of these things do you think we should do? Because it's a lot, right? But that's our own anxiety playing itself out. What did I miss? What more can I feed into you to make sure that you're safe and sound and secure? But the truth of the matter is that we don't control that. And as a parent, that's a hard thing to come to grips with as your child your child grows up and is out there in that big bad world, is that you can prepare and love them all that you can, and you still don't have control. There are no guarantees that their life is going to work out, and something bad may happen. That is the hardest thing about parenting, is living with that truth. But the alternative is to stop them from growing. And that in my view, would be the sad outcome. If my kids were sitting safe in my basement or in their rooms at home, with me feeling comforted in the fact that I knew what they were doing and where they were, but not owning their own lives, I think that would be the sadder outcome. So I have to remind myself of that, when I get the urge to step in. And that's why I tell people parenting is hard. It isn't just hard because it's hard. It's hard because it's emotionally, you are in your most vulnerable space. Now, I could go on and on, but I do write about a lot of that in the book.
One of the other things you touch on in the book is you are very open and candid about acknowledging the fact that you have support and you have help and you have had help throughout your life in raising your children. And you point out that any high-earning, successful women who purport to have it all and do it all, they've got help. So I want to ask you, what disservice do we do to people, particularly women and caregivers, when we don't all acknowledge and aren't as transparent about the fact that we have help, especially given that we are coming out of a 2 to 3 year period that has exposed so much strain in our caregiving infrastructure in this country?
Well, that's the trope that we wear as women, that we're supposed to be able to do it all. And I don't know where that came from. When I look back on the women in my life, it was a real necessity. The matriarchs of our household did do it all as Black women with men whose opportunities were limited because of Jim Crow and segregation, where a Black man was more of a threat. So a Black woman could, have a more consistency in their earning potential, but still had to hold down the traditional wife and mother role of cooking and child rearing. If I look back over my personal history, I can see where, that's what was modeled to us, that the mothers in our lives did everything. They mothered, they worked, they took care of the home. So we're emulating that, particularly as women of color. That's a sign of strength, so we don't ask for help. We are not conditioned to think that that's not a weakness. So yes, I think it's a disservice when those of us who are out here modeling it aren't being real clear about the fact that we are not meant to do this life alone. We are not meant, I believe, we were not meant to parent alone. The whole concept of a nuclear family, just me, my husband, if you're lucky, and the kids, and this is our unit and we live independently, that's a fairly new phenomenon to our generation. For decades, people have lived in extended family units. I wrote about that in Becoming. I grew up in a community surrounded by family members. I had maternal grandparents around the corner, paternal grandparents, down the street. We lived above the home of a great aunt. We saw each other regularly, our families, cousins together, almost every weekend, celebrating birthday parties. And I can't think of a time where I had to have a babysitter, because there was just always somebody that was chipping in. Somebody would pop over. You'd go over somebody else's house. So now here we sit in our generation. Many of us have moved away from our family units, our communities of support, and we're off in some city with a big job, still trying to emulate what our grandparents and grandmothers and fathers did. That doesn't work. Yeah. You need, if you're working outside of the home, because we all are working inside of the home, there is no shame and getting support. Your kids will value it. They will value you being less stressful. Now, the guilty part of that piece, if you're a woman who has the resources, is that we all know women who don't have that choice. So sometimes we hide it because it's like, dag, how am I talking about a nanny and a this and a that when I know that there are women, my peers, my cousins, who don't have that support. They're doing just as much as I'm doing, but they can't afford, they don't have access to affordable childcare. They couldn't think of having a nanny, they don't have flexibility in their work schedule. So part of it is that there's a kind of survivor's remorse about what you're able to do. But I think we still have to talk about the fact that family units have to be based on a big community of support. There is there is nothing particularly courageous about doing life alone, you know. But you know, if those of us who are doing it aren't being honest about how hard that is and what it takes to actually get it right, then we're mirroring the wrong things for the generation to come. And I don't want to do that to my girls, you know?
Yeah. One of the things that you walk through in the book, and you talk about a number of the ways in which your life and the journey that your family has been on has been incredibly exceptional. But you also talk about some incredibly relatable experiences, such as the isolation of being the only, whether it is the only woman of color, the only Black person in the room, of being the only person who didn't come from money at a college. And I wonder, now, all these years later in the journey that you have been on, do you still feel that way sometimes, and how do you deal with it?
You know, honestly, of course, as Michelle Obama, you know, I feel it less acutely. But that's fairly recent, you know. I mean, when we were in the White House, we were the first and the only at many tables of power, watching people adjust to that. That was very reminiscent of the experiences that I had, you know, going to college and practicing in a corporate law firm and sitting around board seats and on and on and on. But what I found is over time, and I write about this, is that, you know, we can't change that reality. We are still sadly breaking barriers, right? I mean, it is unfortunate that the percentages of students of color on college campuses is remaining relatively, sadly, stagnant. The same is true, and if you look at corporate law, the numbers of associates and partners in large firms has not really significantly increased. So we still are struggling to make progress. So in the meantime, we're dealing with the reality of the fact that, yeah, we're still trying to fill those seats. So how do we get through in the meantime? Because when you're an only, there's as I describe it, there's a feeling of walking around trying to navigate a town or a city with a roadmap that doesn't fit. You know, you're playing a game with someone else's rules. You feel isolated and disconnected, sometimes outside of your own body. And what happens when that occurs is that you start feeling self-conscious. You spend more time thinking about your onlyness. You're carrying that burden rather than focusing on the task at hand. And that makes overcoming all that just even more difficult. What I had to learn to do was to first get out of my own head about it.
Not easy, though.
It's not. It is not an easy thing to do, and it takes practice. But part of what this book is reminding us is that there are no miracle answers to these things. Overcoming imposter syndrome, feeling like you belong, right? There isn't these are the 3 steps you take to feeling seen, right? Doesn't happen that way. For me, I have practiced trying to get out of my head for 58 years now. It is a daily reminder that I have to take the mask that I am trying to hold up on my face, take it down so that I can see what I'm doing. And by mask, I mean trying to stop pretending to be something that I'm not, trying to fit in and leave behind the parts of me that make me real and authentic. Stop worrying about how I wear my hair and what somebody is going to think about it. You know, stop thinking about how I conjugate my verbs or what stories I tell about myself to make me fit into somebody else's world. That we get in our way with that, but it takes practice. And I open the book by urging young people to read it, to understand that patience is an important tool in developing your own set of tools. What I am able to do now, the messages that I tell myself now at 58, are very different than what I needed to say to myself at 20. But I now have a lifetime of understanding that I have been practicing through being the only, of quieting my doubtful mind and then speaking up and using my experiences as the source code, as I say, to the power that I actually have and bring. It doesn't happen overnight, but we have to keep telling ourselves, I am going to show up in the world as my authentic self, and that is good enough. That's the work that we have to do. I wish there were shortcuts, but it is what it is.
You mentioned patience, and that is something that I've been wanting to ask you about. You mentioned earlier the call to action that many of us know you for. When they go low, we go high. And in a past life before I had this job, I was a political correspondent, and I spent a lot of time traveling this country and talking to young people in particular. And what I heard a lot, and I'm sure you hear this too from the people who write you letters or come to events that you hold, is the fact that they want to believe in a world of going high, but they feel a sense of urgency. Oftentimes they express that they feel a sense of rage given all of the hurt and harm and marginalization, the insurrection, attacks on LGBTQ rights, anti-Semitism. The laundry list could go on. How does going high square with the urgency that so many people feel, especially young people feel in this moment?
Well, that's the interesting thing, because some young people interpret going high as being complacent. Going high doesn't mean sitting on the side of the road and watching, injustice go by. Going high is about having a strategy, a real concrete strategy for change. It's taking the rage and turning it into reason so that you can actually be heard and move toward change. So when I think about going high, I'm usually thinking at a time when I'm feeling the rage and I feel the need to react. I've learned to ask myself, am I indulging my rage? Is what I'm about to do or say going to make me feel good in the short term, but have no impact over the long term, right? Because the goal is the impact, ultimately, That's what Barack and I had to do every day in the White House. I used to play this game with my communication staff before an interview or something, where we would sort of walk through the questions, and there'd be some question that would be what I'd call a knucklehead question, and I'd practice my true response, right? My I shouldn't say true, my gut response. Because sometimes just playing it out loud helps to get it out. But then when you put your first gut reaction out there for the world to see and hear, and then you look at it for a minute and you go, well, that's not even how I really feel, and what's going to be the outcome? There's going to be half the country that won't even hear the rest of the solution if I start there. If I start with my rage and anger, all I will do is play out my rage and anger, but I won't be able to affect any change. Going high is about the ultimate goal of where are we trying to go and what's the best way to get there. And over the course of history, especially the history of civil rights, there was the rage, but there was always the plan. The March on Washington was the cherry on top after decades of legislative action and strategic sit downs. The march wasn't the beginning or the end. And that's what we have to figure out. What is the true beginning and where are we trying to get to? There's room for rage in that. There's urgency in that. The other thing I try to remind young people is that it's easy to look at what your predecessors have done and to say, not enough. Why not? Why not faster? Why not better? Why not bigger? And what I say is young people aren't wrong to feel that. That's why folks need to get out of the way and pass on the power to the next generation. But what we can't lose sight of is that every generation in this movement toward whatever change, they are laying the marker that they can at the time. They are working within the confines with the doubts in their heads, the history that they come from. We do ourselves no good by being mad because the folks on our team didn't do more. People are doing what they can do with what they have. And I can guarantee you that this generation of young people that are complaining about the lack of urgency will get to our age, and their kids will look at them and say, why didn't you do more faster? The nature of change, it is a slog. It is a marathon, and it will never feel like enough, because until everything is perfect, it will always be urgent. But in the meantime, what I urge young people to do is be rageful, and own it, but have a plan, have a strategy that can work. Know what it is. Be thoughtful about that approach, and make sure that what you say is really what you mean and how you feel over the long term and not just today.
Mm-hmm. You know, it strikes me as you write about how imperative it is that we should still go high, that we're coming out of this period where all of us have faced so many challenges. Tomorrow, former President Trump is expected to announce that he's going to run for president yet again. And I just wonder, you talk about this toolbox. What goes through your head and what tools do you reach for when you think about something like that?
Oh, and my husband helps me with this. I think about the context of the history of our country, of our world, and I realize that, this is a moment. This is a moment, and we cannot let a moment turn us so upside down that we can't function. The arc of change doesn't just go straight up. It goes up and down and up and down. And so in these moments, I ask myself, and this is a chapter that I call the power of small, right? What can I do in this moment that I can uniquely control when I think something's about to happen that I cannot control, right? Voting is one of those things. It doesn't feel like a lot. It's a small action that happens on a Tuesday every couple of years. Would happen more if people voted more and focused on their local elections too. But that's one of those things, If you don't like the guy that's running, the power that we have in our democracy, however small it is that we each have the responsibility and the right to vote, at least right now. So let us exercise it, so that we're not in a position to take it for granted and have those rights snatched away. Because let me tell you, if we don't use them, if we don't protect them fiercely, even when the person who won isn't somebody that we agree with, we will lose those rights. We've seen it with abortion rights. We've seen it. We've experienced it. I can't tell you how many times we got on the campaign trail over the last 8 years and said, this election is important, because the Supreme Court is at risk. It matters who's on the Supreme Court. Roe v. Wade is in jeopardy. And watching election after election, people not turning out, because they didn't like that guy. They were mad about the fact, why is he even running? And it's not necessarily Trump, but anybody, right? The governor's race, the U.S. attorney, we sit out, we don't do the work because we're mad about who's in. We have this small power, each of us, to shape the direction of the country. And if we don't use it, I never want to throw my hands up, but I think, well, what are we going to do in this democracy if we quit on it?
Former First Lady Michelle Obama, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much.